It was just past dawn over Moscow. The streets still quiet. The Kremlin cast in morning shadow, and above, so high above no eye could see something foreign, slid silently across the sky. At 70,000 feet, where no Soviet aircraft could fly and no missile could reach, the contrail of an American U-2 spy plane drew a faint white scar above the capital of the Soviet Union. Inside the heavily guarded command center of Soviet air defense, alarms began to flicker. Something, maybe a bird, maybe weather, was triggering partial signals at the edge of their northern perimeter. Radar operators scanned their green-lit screens, but the familiar, comforting arcs of bogey signals never came. The boards remained empty. Then, the telephone rang. From a listening post near Arkhangelsk, a report. Unidentified radar echo, at extreme altitude. Duration 6 minutes. Faded northwest. The officer taking the call dismissed it. A fluke. A glitch. Nothing could be at that altitude. But above, Richard Bissell's masterpiece, a Lockheed-designed reconnaissance craft shrouded in secrecy, was executing a perfect track across Soviet territory. It photographed airfields, missile silos, factories, and government compounds. The U-2's wide-angle cameras, developed by the CIA's most elite optical engineers, captured Moscow with chilling clarity. Every rail yard, every runway, every radar array. And then, as silently as it came, it slipped back over the border. Not a single interceptor launched, not a single missile armed, and most importantly, not a single Soviet commander could explain what had just happened. Later that day, when the Kremlin reviewed Western radio chatter, a single phrase emerged. Mission successful. Full recon sweep. Complete. Panic didn't come immediately. It came slowly. Incredulity. Then denial. Then fear. Because what just happened wasn't supposed to be possible. The Soviet homeland, the fortress behind the Iron Curtain, had been pierced without warning, without resistance, and without a trace. A ghost had flown over Moscow, and it had seen everything. For years, Soviet air defense planners operated on a central, comforting belief that their homeland was sealed. Their radar net, the vaunted PVO system, stretched across 11 time zones. From Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, rings of detection and interception stood ready to intercept any Western incursion. The premise was simple. Height and distance were surmountable. Speed could be matched. Aircraft could be tracked, guided, destroyed. The math was clear. No bomber could sneak in. No jet could climb fast enough, high enough, to strike deep into the heartland without being spotted, tracked, and obliterated. This wasn't hubris. It was reinforced by every radar test, every intercept exercise, and every official report. The MiG-17 seconds and MiG-19 seconds, stationed across the USSR's interior, formed the backbone of this belief. Fast, armed, ready. And then, the U-2 made that belief obsolete. In a single flight, at 70,000 feet, the U-2 flew in a stratosphere where Soviet doctrine had placed no threats. Radar physics became unreliable at those altitudes. Tracking algorithms grew unstable. Reflections weakened. Radar stations had been calibrated for bombers flying at 30,000 to 50,000 feet. The range expected of American B-36 seconds, or B-47 seconds. And the interceptors? They could barely reach 45,000 before performance collapsed. Still, inside the war rooms of the PVO command structure, generals dismissed the early signs. A few scattered anomalies on radar. Reports of phantom returns, no wreckage, no violations logged. Their systems, they insisted, were intact. The very design of the U-2 exploited this arrogance. Kelly Johnson at Lockheed didn't just build a high-altitude aircraft. He built a ghost. Its thin, glider-like wings, minimal radar signature, and cruising altitude placed it in a vertical no-man's land. Not quite a satellite, not quite a plane, just high enough to vanish into doctrine's blind spot. Meanwhile, inside the Kremlin, leadership relied on filtered intelligence. Reports passed through multiple layers before reaching senior ears. Each intermediary smoothed the edges, softened the threat. No one wanted to be the one to say, "We cannot see our own skies." So they said what Moscow wanted to hear. The homeland was secure. And in doing so, they left their capital wide open. Not to bombs, not to missiles, but to something far more dangerous. The truth, the U-2 wasn't built to destroy Moscow. It was built to see it. And what it saw exposed the fault line beneath the entire Soviet defense system. The Soviet Union had always framed its defense in terms of hard walls, interceptor squadrons, SAM belts, and concentric rings of radar coverage. This layered shield, known as the PVO Strainy, was designed not just to detect threats, but to overwhelm them. The idea was simple. If a bomber was spotted, it would be intercepted within minutes by a waiting MiG, tracked the entire time by ground-based radar, and destroyed before it reached any strategic asset. But all of it, every flight plan, every radar net, every missile silo, was optimized for one thing: the mid-altitude bomber threat. The doctrine assumed that aircraft could not sustain flight above 60,000 feet. That assumption held until the Americans stopped designing planes for combat and started designing them for reconnaissance. The U-2 shattered every PVO expectation. It climbed beyond 70,000 feet with ease. Its glider-like shape gave it extraordinary lift at thin altitudes, and most critically, it flew too high for interceptors and too early for anti-aircraft missiles to engage. Soviet radar systems like the P-20 and P-30, while powerful, weren't calibrated for such extremes. They had blind cones at high altitudes. The longer the wavelength, the harder it became to detect a small aircraft at the edge of space. Operators stared at screens where the U-2 passed invisibly above their heads, and even if they could see it, the MiG-17, the workhorse of the Air Defense Force, could barely reach 45,000 feet. The newer MiG-19, still in limited deployment, peaked near 55,000. Neither had the vertical reach or the missile systems to challenge the U-2's domain. Doctrine said those altitudes were unreachable, and so nothing had been prepared for them. The Americans knew it. From its inception, the U-2 had been built to exploit the altitude gap in Soviet coverage. The CIA's project team had reviewed declassified Soviet radar specs, engine thrust tables, and high-altitude flight data. Every piece of evidence pointed to a fatal hole in the Soviet defense shield, not a small gap, but an entire layer of sky left undefended. The doctrine was flawed not because it failed, it was flawed because it never imagined someone would attack from that high. And in war, imagination is sometimes more powerful than firepower. The Americans had imagined the impossible altitude. The Soviets had imagined it didn't matter. Now their assumptions were flying above them silently, surgically, and with cameras rolling. On the 4th of July 1956, Independence Day in the United States, the CIA launched its first deep penetration U-2 flight directly over the Soviet Union. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was an operational gamble that would redefine aerial espionage forever. The target: Leningrad to Moscow, and every military installation in between. As dawn broke, the U-2, piloted by veteran test pilot Hervey Stockman, crossed over the Soviet border at high altitude. His instructions were clear: maintain altitude above 70,000 feet, avoid unnecessary maneuvers, and activate the camera systems only over predetermined sites. What he didn't know was that on the ground below, no one saw him coming. Radar stations in Estonia and Belarus blinked with partial traces. Operators weren't sure if they were real. No audible confirmation, no visual trails. And when they radioed the next node, in the chain silence, Soviet ground command dismissed the anomalies. Faulty weather returns, radio interference, equipment miscalibration. But as Stockman reached Moscow airspace, the U-2's cameras began their silent work. Sweeping panoramic optics captured the full extent of the capital's military-industrial complex: airfields, SAM sites under construction, and most alarmingly, ballistic missile facilities. From 13 miles above the Kremlin, the U-2 recorded images with astonishing detail. Trucks could be counted, troop movements traced, runway conditions assessed. Not one interceptor launched. Stockman completed his pass, turned south, and exited Soviet territory over the Caspian Sea. Back in Washington, the film was rushed to a secure lab. Hours later, intelligence analysts stared in stunned silence. They could read license plates, see which runways had fresh tarmac, confirm the location of R and D sites the Pentagon had only speculated about. It was the single most valuable aerial intelligence collection in U.S. history, and it came with zero resistance. Soviet leadership was initially unaware. Radar logs were incomplete. No one had seen the aircraft. But within days, intercepted, Western communications gleaned by Soviet SIGINT confirmed that something had crossed their skies. Not just any aircraft, but a manned platform. A plane with a pilot. The impossible had occurred. An American had flown over the Soviet heartland, and they had done nothing to stop it. The consequences would echo through every hall of command. Within weeks, frantic directives went out to recheck radar calibrations, retrain operators, and rearm interceptors. But it was already too late. The first strike hadn't carried a bomb. It had carried film, and that film would change the Cold War. The initial reports, trickling in through Soviet intelligence intercepts and foreign press chatter, were so implausible that the Kremlin dismissed them outright. An American aircraft had flown over Moscow undetected, at an altitude no known plane could sustain? Impossible. Marshal Sergei Biryuzov, head of the PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, reportedly dismissed the claim as Western disinformation. Others suggested it was a psychological operation, a bluff, a desperate attempt to project technological superiority. After all, the Soviet radar logs were clean. No intrusions, no tracking data, no confirmed sightings. The truth, however, was beginning to leak through cracks in the wall of denial. In Washington, Eisenhower's administration had kept the U-2 program classified, but fragments of its success began appearing in NATO intelligence briefings. British and West German officials received strategic updates containing details of Soviet installations that could only have come from direct overflight photography. The Kremlin's paranoia ignited. If the Americans had these photos, if they truly had flown above Soviet airspace without resistance, then every foundational belief of the Soviet security apparatus was in question. The illusion of airspace integrity was evaporating. But still, official Moscow clung to disbelief. Politburo meetings devolved into quiet blame games. The PVO command insisted the aircraft never entered Soviet airspace. KGB officials, embarrassed and blindsided, offered alternate explanations. Perhaps the Americans used a satellite. Perhaps it was a high-altitude balloon. Perhaps some even whispered it was fabricated entirely. What they could not admit was the most obvious and damning truth: that the U.S. had flown a manned spy plane over the most heavily defended nation on Earth and had gotten away with it. To admit that was to admit that the entire Soviet concept of strategic deterrence had failed, that every anti-aircraft gun, every interceptor wing, every radar operator across 11 time zones had been defeated not by a fleet but by a single aircraft. But reality became harder to suppress. More U-2 flights followed, each one collecting clearer photos, each one crossing deeper into Soviet territory. Western newspapers began publishing satellite-style imagery long before the Soviet Union had a satellite of its own. And still, no Soviet response because they had no capability to respond. By the end of 1956, the internal reports were no longer deniable. The Americans had pierced the skies. And Moscow's silence wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was fear. Faced with undeniable overflights, yet lacking radar confirmation or interception data, Soviet military scientists searched for a scapegoat. The theory that gained the most traction because it preserved institutional pride was simple. The Americans were jamming radar. It was a seductive explanation. Electronic countermeasures were a known component of Western aircraft. U.S. bombers had used jammers in World War II. The new B-47 seconds were equipped with basic electronic warfare packages. So, It seemed plausible that the U-2, somehow, was masking its altitude or position with advanced jamming technology. In hastily convened conferences within the Ministry of Defense, specialists proposed that U.S. aircraft were using high-frequency pulse distortion to scramble Soviet radar returns. Others speculated the use of chaff clouds or even directed microwave bursts. These were science-fictional ideas. But in an era where Soviet engineers had not yet even seen a U-2, nothing could be ruled out. Orders went out to test and recalibrate radar systems with simulated jamming scenarios. But the truth remained unchanged. The U-2 was not jamming anything. It didn't need to. Its defense was altitude, and altitude alone. The Soviet radar systems, especially the older VHF arrays like the P-8 and P-10, were never built to reliably track small targets above 60,000 feet. Even the newer P-30 units struggled with low radar cross-section objects at high vertical angles. The U-2 exploited the physics of radar degradation at oblique angles and extreme elevations. Worse still, Soviet interceptors were deployed based on predicted bomber corridors. The high-altitude overflights cut diagonally across sectors, skipping the response timelines of pre-positioned squadrons. But the electronic warfare theory was politically convenient. It meant the Soviet systems weren't outdated, merely tricked. It meant the engineers weren't blind, just temporarily outmatched by an unseen technology. It allowed for face-saving. So, for a time, Moscow poured resources into ECM detection programs. Entire battalions were tasked with signal analysis. Interceptor pilots were retrained on electronic threat protocols. New filters were added to radar sets. Still, the U-2 kept flying. The theory was comforting, but every failed interception made it harder to believe. Eventually, even the most loyal officers began to whisper, "What if it's not jamming at all?" Because if it wasn't, then the Americans hadn't deceived them. They had simply outflown them. As radar modifications failed to bear fruit and jamming theories lost credibility, Soviet air defense planners shifted toward a different explanation. One even more bizarre, yet equally convenient. This time, the claim was that the object traversing Soviet skies wasn't an aircraft at all. It was a balloon, or perhaps a satellite. The theory emerged from within the PVO's Scientific Advisory Board, whose task was to explain why something had crossed Soviet airspace without triggering alerts, without visible propulsion trails, and without reaction from the missile network. Perhaps, they said, it wasn't a powered object. Perhaps it drifted with the winds too high to track, too slow to require interception, too fragile to warrant counterforce. The balloon theory gained quick support from senior leadership, who had already faced months of internal pressure over radar blind spots. Weather balloons had long been used for scientific study, and the United States had launched thousands of them globally. Some carried cameras, others sensors. Some were massive and floated higher than 100,000 feet. And since a balloon wasn't a traditional threat, it didn't carry bombs, it didn't fly on command, it could be safely dismissed as a nuisance rather than a breach. Of course, it was also entirely wrong. The U-2 was no balloon. It was powered, piloted, navigated by the most experienced test aviators in the United States. It flew with deliberate purpose, plotted over strategic military targets, and returned with footage that shaped global policy. But in 1956, to admit that meant conceding that the U.S. had technological superiority, not just in aircraft design, but in altitude control, optics, and stealth flight. That truth was too costly, so instead, a directive went out. All future suspected overflights should be logged as unidentified atmospheric anomalies, unless proven otherwise. This allowed commanders to file radar anomalies without assigning blame or triggering escalation. Some within the GRU suspected the balloon theory was just another deflection, a political shield to delay real reform. KGB analysts noted inconsistencies. The U-2 changed course mid-flight. It climbed, it turned, it maneuvered with precision no drifting balloon could replicate. Still, the official stance held. It was easier to blame weather. It was easier to call it wind, because to call it what it really was, A strategic defeat at 70,000 feet meant something far more terrifying: that the Americans had created a weapon of pure information, and that the Soviet Union had no defense against it. By early 1957, the Soviet Union's most secret agencies, the GRU and KGB, had been pulled into the mystery of the invisible intruder. The PVO had failed to intercept. Radar stations were inconclusive. The General Staff wanted answers. And, fast, the mission: find the origin point of the U-2 flights, identify their flight paths, and provide coordinates for preemptive intercept or retaliation. But the intelligence map they were working from was riddled with blind spots. Soviet analysts initially suspected the flights were launched from West Germany, then Turkey, then Pakistan. Each new theory triggered a flurry of intelligence gathering, surveillance overflights, and asset deployments. Informants along NATO's southern rim were activated. Signals intelligence stations in Georgia, Armenia, and the Caucasus began scanning air corridors for pre-launch telemetry. The results were worse than inconclusive. They were contradictory. One KGB report placed a U-2 base near Incirlik, Turkey, a plausible staging ground. Another insisted on Cyprus. A third proposed a secret aircraft carrier in the Black Sea. Each had different telemetry readings. None were definitive. Worse, each report caused Soviet command to reroute resources, chase phantoms, and delay real preparation. The Americans, meanwhile, knew this chaos was unfolding. The CIA had intentionally varied U-2 departure sites. Flights originated from Germany, Norway, Turkey, and even a temporary base in Pakistan. This rotation kept Soviet intelligence guessing, unable to triangulate a consistent flight path. More damaging still was the Soviet failure to coordinate internally. The PVO was siloed from the GRU. The KGB distrusted both. Radar anomalies were filed by local commanders, but not centralized fast enough to reconstruct patterns. And no single agency had access to the full flight telemetry, just fragments. The result: missed opportunities, conflicting intelligence, and a fog of paranoia. Intercept attempts were launched, but always too late. Interceptors scrambled minutes after the U-2 had already crossed back into friendly airspace. Orders were given to shoot on sight, but by the time Soviet pilots reached maximum altitude, the ghost was gone. On one occasion, a MiG-19 came within visual range but could not climb to engagement altitude. The pilot watched, helpless, as the U-2 glided silently across the upper sky, immune to pursuit. Inside the Kremlin, frustration boiled over. A classified GRU briefing to the Politburo concluded with a chilling sentence: "We see the flights only in retrospect. The Americans see us in real time." This was not just a reconnaissance problem. It was a doctrinal breakdown, a system designed for blunt threats now paralyzed by subtlety. And the longer it lasted, the more information the U.S. collected. Each failed interception wasn't just a missed kill. It was another page torn from the Soviet playbook, photographed, archived, and flown back to Washington. The U-2 was not a mere aircraft. It was the manifestation of an entirely new doctrine, a shift from brute force military power to intelligence supremacy. And while the Soviet Union scrambled jets and tuned radar dishes, the United States had already changed the game. This wasn't just about altitude. It was about architecture. The architecture of the U.S. system. The true weapon was the fusion of three unlikely forces: Lockheed's engineering innovation, the CIA's strategic vision, and President Eisenhower's quiet gamble on knowledge over firepower. At its heart was the CIA's Project Aquatone, launched in absolute secrecy. The agency, frustrated by its dependence on military reconnaissance and satellite delays, took an unprecedented step. It built its own air force. Not bombers, not fighters, but surveillance aircraft designed to fly over enemy territory, document everything, and leave before anyone knew they were there. Enter Clarence Kelly Johnson and his skunkworks team. In just 8 months, they designed the U-2 lightweight, fragile, and capable of operating in a realm previously thought unreachable. It had a wingspan longer than a B-17 but weighed a fraction of a fighter. It flew at 70,000 feet, powered by a single turbojet engine stripped of military hardpoints. No armor, no weapons. Just speed, altitude, and silence. But what made the system lethal was what it carried. The U-2's camera array was a technological marvel. With ultra-high-resolution lenses and motion-compensated film spools, it could photograph a license plate from 13 miles up. Each mission gathered miles of film, developed in underground labs, analyzed frame by frame by specialists at the National Photographic Interpretation Center. And what they saw was never random. The CIA, through its growing satellite network, foreign assets, and cryptographic intercepts, compiled target lists down to the building. Missile development centers in Turatam, air bases in Engels, shipyards in Severodvinsk. Each flight was a scalpel, carving data from the body of Soviet secrecy. Behind it all stood Eisenhower, a former general who knew the cost of war. He authorized the U-2 missions not to provoke but to know. His belief that superior knowledge would prevent surprise. That by removing the veil from Soviet intentions, the U.S. could avoid catastrophic miscalculation. And it worked. The U.S. knew the true strength of Soviet ICBM programs, the deployment rate of long-range bombers, and even the construction status of radar arrays. Soviet gaps were exposed as exaggerations. The bomber gap, the missile gap, illusions shattered by glass negatives. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite its industrial power, was flying blind. The irony was brutal. They had more jets, more guns, more soldiers. But the U.S. had the one weapon that reshaped every calculation: certainty. The U-2 didn't just show what was there. It showed what wasn't: the absent fleets, the incomplete systems, the hollow boasts. And the Soviet Union had no counter, because it wasn't the U-2 they had to shoot down. It was the idea that information itself could be a strategic weapon. And that idea had already taken flight. The humiliation didn't explode in one moment. It unfolded in 1,000 slow shocks, each one more embarrassing than the last. But by 1960, the illusion of invulnerability had been shattered. And then, finally, it all came crashing down in one headline: American spy plane shot down over Soviet Union. The U-2 flight of Francis Gary Powers was meant to be the capstone. A final, audacious sweep from Pakistan to Norway. A complete vertical cut across the Soviet heartland. But this time, the Soviets were waiting. They had spent years chasing ghosts. Now, they had upgraded their S-75 Dvina surface to air missile systems. New radar tracking algorithms. Interceptor protocols revised with foreign data leaks. And, more importantly, they got lucky. On the 1st of May 1960, the S-75 missile battery near Sverdlovsk locked on. Powers' U-2 was cruising at 70,500 feet when a salvo of V-750 missiles detonated in its flight path. The shockwave didn't destroy the U-2 directly. It severed a wing, forced a spin, and dropped the plane into Soviet hands. Powers survived. So did the cameras. So did the film. And the Americans lied. The initial U.S. response claimed a weather research plane had gone off course. It was a disastrous miscalculation. Within days, Khrushchev revealed not only the wreckage, but Powers himself alive, captured, and cooperative. It was a diplomatic catastrophe. Eisenhower was forced to admit the truth. The CIA had flown dozens of missions over Soviet territory. The Soviets, humiliated in silence for years, finally had a victory, and they used it like a hammer. Khrushchev canceled the planned Paris summit. The Soviets paraded the wreckage and pilot across state media. Anti-American protests surged across the Eastern Bloc. The Kremlin's propaganda machine shifted from defensive to triumphant. But even in victory, there was an edge of bitterness, because the damage had already been done. For 4 years, the U-2 had crossed Soviet skies unchallenged. It had photographed missile sites under construction. It had exposed false deployments, debunked Soviet ICBM threats, and mapped entire air defense sectors. It had proven that the U.S. knew everything, and that the Soviet Union had been helpless to stop it. Even worse, Power's flight was meant to be the last manned mission. Within months, the Corona satellite program would render spy planes obsolete. The era of space-based surveillance had already begun. So while the Soviets celebrated a single downed aircraft, the Americans quietly moved the battlefield to orbit. In the end, the U-2 wasn't remembered for its shoot-down. It was remembered for what it saw before it fell, and for how long it humiliated the most militarized state in history by simply flying too high to touch. The U-2 flights did more than collect images. They dismantled the foundation of Soviet strategic confidence. Not with explosions, but with exposure. Each photograph, the U.S. captured, didn't just map Soviet capabilities, it documented their gaps, their deceptions, and their fears. For decades, the Soviet doctrine of strength had rested on one myth, that the USSR was an impenetrable fortress, a shield of steel, a sky locked tight. But the U-2 had slipped through that myth again and again. And worse, it had proven that Western intelligence knew more about the Soviet Union than the Soviet Union knew about itself. That realization triggered a slow unraveling within Soviet command culture. First came the internal purges. Air defense officers demoted or dismissed, radar specialists accused of negligence, intelligence directors quietly reassigned. The KGB launched investigations not into the Americans but into their own military leadership. Then came the strategic redirection. Soviet focus shifted from manned interceptors to missile-based defense. The S-75 and later S-125 systems became the backbone of a frantic modernization campaign. Billions of rubles were redirected to radar coverage, missile silos, and eventually satellite reconnaissance to match the West. But it wasn't just military reform. It was ideological retreat. The USSR had been embarrassed not by an enemy fleet or overwhelming firepower, but by visibility. A single aircraft with no weapons had seen what was never meant to be seen. And that knowledge, disseminated across NATO, had rebalanced global strategy. The U.S., thanks to U-2 imagery, confirmed that the so-called bomber gap was fiction. The missile gap, too. Soviet arsenals were far smaller and more fragile than claimed. As a result, Washington was able to calibrate its own arms race not in fear, but in precision. And while Moscow poured money into catching up, the West surged ahead in the information war. The Soviet model, secretive, centralized, paranoid, was unsuited to technological transparency. It could not evolve fast enough to counter a system designed for agility and truth. And in that contrast, the ideological foundations of the Cold War began to shift. The myth of Soviet invulnerability had been a pillar of the Iron Curtain. Now, that pillar had a camera hole punched straight through it. Long after the last U-2 had crossed the Soviet horizon, its shadow remained. Not in the skies, but in the minds of Soviet commanders, in the rewrites of air defense doctrine, and in the whispered admissions behind closed Kremlin doors. They saw everything. The U-2's legacy wasn't its final crash in 1960, but what it revealed before it fell. It proved that in the age of ideology and arsenals, vision was the real superweapon. That a single machine, flying too high to intercept, could shatter illusions more completely than any bomb. In the years that followed, both the United States and the Soviet Union launched satellites, built missile shields, and raced toward the stars. But the U-2 remained a totem, a relic of a moment when one side soared into a new kind of warfare, and the other could only watch from the ground. Today, fragments of U-2 fuselage sit in Russian museums, surrounded by rusted SAMs and the preserved wreckage of failed interceptors. Schoolchildren pass by, unaware that these artifacts represent the day Soviet commanders realized their empire had cracks they couldn't patch. In a war never declared, the U-2 drew the first line, not with fire, but with sight. It proved that the greatest danger to secrecy wasn't sabotage. It was clarity.